Hi, welcome. So this is a little series of vlogs I'm going to do here, and this is going to be number one. We're going to try to take a look at possible trends of recent Supreme Court decisions. Um, this Supreme Court has been probably the most remarkable Supreme Court, maybe of all time. And their decisions, though largely accurate, are questionable when we talk about ethics and acting within accordance to their obligations and their oath. So, is there really some illegitimacy occurring within our Supreme Courts? Um, and that's hopefully something that every person can determine their own um, opinion as we go through and just kind of look at what's going on. And so the first case I want to talk to you about is Dobbs versus Jackson, Women's Health Organization. So this is regarding abortion. So it is a sensitive topic, and I mean no offense to anyone. I'm going to just purely look at a scientific lens with mixed with a little bit of political lens and just history and how we've come to be as a nation and what our laws as they're written truly mean, which is the purpose of, by the way, the Supreme Court. And we're going to talk about this. The Supreme Court's, these judges, actually in any court, their only role is really to hear cases and interpret the law as it is written and how it pertains to the case, and then ultimately participate in the judgment or the outcome of that case. And so sometimes you're convicted by a jury, and it's actually the jury making the judgment upon you. But the judge's role is to make sure that there's legal fairness. And so it's highly important that these judges are not biased in any way. And so let's take a look, let's dive in. So the first question we have to ask ourselves in our review and our analysis of these recent trends are, I think it's important to start with what are unalienable, or depending on what version of English you speak, inalienable rights. What are these God-given rights? Well, to understand that, we have to look at where this terminology even comes from. It comes from the Declaration of Independence, which is largely written by Thomas Jefferson. And of course, the initial phrase that we're discussing here is a Thomas Jefferson line that was written by Thomas Jefferson. And who inspired Jefferson on this topic was a gentleman by the name of Sir William Blackstone. Sir William Blackstone in 1745 creates this genius and document that goes into detail about absolute rights, absolute duties, and relative rights, and so and how they pertain to society and nature just in general. So absolute rights are where Jefferson gets this idea of inalienable rights. They're essentially synonymous, right? And so absolute rights, as defined by Sir William Blackstone, these are absolute rights which are so in their primary and strictest sense, such as would belong to their persons merely in a state of nature, in which every man is entitled to enjoy, whether out of society or in it. So these are our rights endowed to us by our Creator automatically. And we gain these rights naturally. And right, so whether we would be a domesticated species or a wild species, whether we're civilized or not, we would have these rights. And so absolute rights refer to those rights that connect us to nature and science. And with regard to absolute duties, they are not to be expected, according to Sir Oxford William Blackstone, the influencer behind Thomas Jefferson's publishings, leading to the creation of the Declaration of Independence, that any human municipal law should at all explain or enforce them. So what does this mean? Well, to me, it's pretty clear. No government, no human civilized law should interfere. They should not try to explain. They should not try to enforce these absolute duties, which are essentially responsibilities that are given to us with our absolute right. And so, right in there is, I mean, you really need to go no further to make a decision regarding abortion, because, and we're going to get further into this, but I mean, it's very clear that these absolute duties, which later we're going to learn that abortion is actually an absolute duty. And so that's not to be interfered with or interpreted or enforced. It's literally right in there, you find your right to freedom of choice, right? And so let's take a look at the next slide. Absolute rights, and this is important, absolute rights versus relative rights. So as we discussed, absolute rights are granted by a creator. They're coupled with absolute duties or a responsibility to act connectedly with nature. They're inseparable. They cannot be taken away and cannot be expected to be explained or enforced by human municipal law. So Thomas Jefferson gives us three good examples. And he even, it's pretty evident that he's not limiting it to just these examples. And these are pretty broad categories, and I think you could actually fit all absolute rights within these three categories. So we're going to focus just on one of them in this video, but life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. So these are absolute rights, and these are actually defined in the Constitution as absolute rights by our founding fathers. And so relative rights, these are rights that result from the formation of states and societies. So these are the primary goal of these rights is to protect and preserve the individual's absolute rights. So you get the Bill of Rights, take a look. The right to bear arms, that's a relative right. It's not a right that you would necessarily, well, you could philosophically, you could go deep into this and say, well, it's tied to survival, which is a responsibility of life. So technically, the right to bear arms could be construed as an absolute duty. But arms are man-made, they're not natural, and so that's not, in my mind, not gonna fly. Now, life as an absolute right comes with these absolute duties to maintain connectedness to nature. And so think about what that means. I need to be able to determine when there's danger to my survival. So I need to be connected to nature. I need to know my natural smell. I need to know how I naturally look. I need to know how I naturally feel, how I naturally see. I need to be tied into my senses as an individual, and I need to connect it with nature such that I can identify when there is a threat to my survival. And that's my primary absolute duty when we talk about life as an absolute right. Secondarily, I need to be worried about my species. So, and that really comes from evolutionary theory. You find in Darwin's theory, the primary objective is survival, survival of the individual first, and then the species second. And so, and I believe that's what these arrows are referring to here. Mainly, that responsibility can be defined by evolutionary theory, as I just said, and primarily the responsibility of individual survival, and secondarily the survival of the species. And so up here in the picture, you see that I've a piece of this article I read that talks about female infanticide uh, and how it's found in 1/3 of mammal species. It's clearly a natural event. So this is evidence that life uh, is an absolute right that is coupled with an absolute duty of species and individual survival. And it shows that naturally women are endowed by their creator, childbearing women are endowed by their creator to make choices, um, whether or not a life that she created or is creating should continue to be created or should continue to be allowed based on utilitarianism, right? So the greater good of the species secondarily, but first her own survival. So is bearing this child going to be a threat to my survival? And if it's not, is it going to impact the greater good of the species? And this is how natural science and mammal development works. So, yeah, the Supreme Court gets it head on. I mean, Roe versus Wade was unconstitutional because, again, as defined by Sir William Blackstone, no human municipal law should explain or enforce an absolute duty, which we can see how abortion or eliminating a potential threat to your survival or the survival of the greater community, the greater species, um, actually is an absolute duty. And so Roe versus Wade was unconstitutional because it intervened. It tried to explain and enforce an absolute duty. Um, Likewise, this ruling also does that because it then says, well, it's the right of, we need to pass this down to the states. And that is what the Constitution says, but this is in reference to rights that aren't specifically defined in the Constitution. And the right to choice and the right to abortion is covered by the absolute right of life, which is the first right mentioned in the Declaration of Independence. So, therefore, uh, it is actually listed in the Constitution. It does not belong to the states. It does not belong to the federal government. It belongs to the individual. And no one can uphold or enforce that. So childbearing females are endowed upon their absolute right to life, which comes with an absolute duty to protect not only her survival, but the survival of the species. And so nature and science are very utilitarian. They're very much thinking of the greater good, right? And so this means if a mother deems a pregnancy to be a threat to her survival or the survival of the species, she has an absolute duty to choose the best course of action to oblige that absolute duty. That's where she's endowed with that right to choose for her own body and even for her own young. And so, granted, let me stop for a minute. I don't, we are a civilized species. So there, yes, should be some implementations of, limitations. For example, you can't just go out and kill your child because, well, I felt like killing my child. That that is where you're crossing, uh, your wires are crossed. Now you've infringed upon someone else's right to life, and that essentially, I believe, is too far, too wrong. So yeah, there is got to be a limit to when it is appropriate. What is that time frame a woman has to make that decision? Like, this could affect my survival. This could affect the species' survival. And I think now more than ever, it's is the time to really start considering the species survival because we're all screaming sustainability. We're all talking about environment. And who is the biggest enemy to the earth? It is people. So as much as I love all of you, and I wouldn't have it any other way, but there's too many. Obviously, I mean, that's problem number one when we talk about sustainability is way too many people, and people are destructive to the earth. That's a whole nother topic. We can get into that another time. I'm already way longer than I wanted to be on this video. So let's move on. The Supreme Court got it right, but they were still way off. The entire decision to throw out Roe versus Wade was what was right, though it's unlikely that their intent was very constitutional, right, in thought of Constitution. And the reason I say that is because if it was thinking for the Constitution, two things that they did wrong would not have occurred. Number one, the Supreme Court violated the very basics of the Constitution by suggesting that the states even had the authority to intervene with these absolute rights and duties. And number two, the Supreme Court overstepped its scope when it suggested other cases to bring before the court. So the Supreme Court is to behave without bias, and they are not of the authority to bring a case to the court, only to hear and fairly interpret the law in evaluating the outcome of that case. And so if the court's intention was indeed to protect and honor the Constitution, these things wouldn't have occurred. They would have said, you know what, this law is an absolute law, it's an absolute law, and it's not to be enforced or even explained by the government, and so therefore we don't even want to hear this case. The states have no right to intervene. We have no right to intervene. It shall be left to the people, the individuals themselves. So that means, too, that doctors have the right to say, look, I don't support that idea, so I'm not performing that procedure on you. And so there it is. It's a moral and ethical dilemma. It is not to be decided upon by the law. No Supreme Court justice should be affiliated with any religion because separation of church and state, it's impractical, and quite frankly, it's ridiculous to believe that a justice could fairly interpret the law so long as they're bound and committed to a specific ideology. And that goes to not just with religion, but Republican and Democrat. And you know, that is something we focus on as we're nominating these justices, and then as they go through their procedures to become the justice. But actually, it's more often that they ask them, like, oh, do you have Christian values? Well, that's not relevant. And in fact, if you have any Christian, Jewish, Muslim, whatever values, that to me says potential for biases. And that's a risk that I don't think the American people should continue to take. So this really needs to be an obligation for, or a requirement to even become a Supreme Court justice, or any justice for that matter, no biases, and proof and a record and a history of no biases. And so this decision here shows the court's willingness to completely go against the grain and to put its personal values and principles before the good of the majority. Because in most cases, especially in today's populace, because this goes against what I believe too, and it's hard to say, but in a lot of cases, abortion may actually be the right decision for the greater good of the community, of society at large, because we're inundated with homeless, we're inundated with poor people, and unfortunately, that is the reality. And the more that we continue to assist people who wouldn't otherwise have the capability themselves to survive, and I think it's a very noble concept, and I think we should continue along those lines until it becomes detrimental to our environment and detrimental to our species. And we are, if you look at any of the recent studies, scientists are suggesting in 2050, significant threats to not just you and I as individuals, but to our entire species and to all species of the planet. So this is the time to really sit down and have these hard conversations. Removing a female's right to control the evolution of our species is dangerous to the planet. And to the people of today, to the people of tomorrow, and to all other species. So in the next section, we're going to continue to show how the Supreme Court is currently positioning itself as an enemy of the state. It's inflicting terror by establishing a dictatorship and destroying true American values. So next we're going to talk about the decision of yesterday that was just released, which was the 303 Creative versus Elena's decision. And I'm going to take this one probably even further because this decision is mind-boggling. A, from the lens of the Supreme Court that they even heard the case, and then B, if you talk about business ethics, and best practices, why is this even a conversation? And so that there is a little preview into that. Check out the references and credits. Not all of the ideas presented to you are mine originally, and so I've read a lot on the topic. I've read a lot more, but I mostly drew this PowerPoint using quotes and ideas from these 3 sources. Thanks for checking out my video, and I hope to see you on the next one.